lift and shift of VMs doesn't always go that well, and it's expensive, right? And you're really getting the worst of cloud at that point.
So you said that the main drive for app modernization is moving to the cloud and the fact that people are on different form factors.
Diversity, yeah.
So they're on mobile phones, tablets, and PCs. And you think we're around the peak of the amount of work people are throwing at this to get to there?
Yeah, just because obviously the pandemic accelerated a bunch of those forces, but it also made it abundantly clear that if you're not taking advantage of this, you're spending more and getting less.
Yeah.
And so more and more we're seeing that kind of case study where it's like, hey, when you do a good job working in the cloud, you become that kind of cloud native app, it costs you less and it's far more responsive to your business needs. And when you realize that client diversity is important and your programming practice tends to be done by people working on PC for people on the PC, like that was fine, but the majority of your customers, especially if it's public facing, are on phones.
Yeah.
And you're not building
for B2C,
yeah. Yeah, that's just sort of been the reality, right? And so you're not good at that. Like that's hard work. And so whatever we can do to take those things off the table is hugely valuable. But it's becoming table stakes, right? It's becoming normal now that you expect it to work on all devices.
Right. So over time then, eventually everyone will be on the cloud and everyone will have apps that work.
Yeah, the majority. There's always exception cases, right? We're never going to get rid of all of the equipment in our offices, right? It's just a question of what needs to be here. But the fact that we're also just not using offices as much, that there is this push for work from home more and more, then that's actually a routine part. Or it's 4 days out, 1 day in. Like all of those kinds of models speaks to this ubiquitous programming or ubiquitous operations model where it doesn't matter where I am or what device I'm using, it should just work. And so the computer at the office is a different machine from the computer at home. I'm not taking it back and forth. And then maybe I also use a laptop once in a while. And occasionally I have to be able to make decisions from the phone. And so when a normal information worker is just naturally going to use multiple devices, how portable is identity? How clear are those workflows in those different form factors? You're not asking them to learn any one of them. You're asking for them to be comfortable in all of them.
Yeah. I think another big, just in our space as Microsoft Stack developers, a big shift, seismic shift that happened was the move from .NET Standard to .NET Core.
Yeah.
And then now, in order to take advantage of that and to move forward, you've got to basically redevelop your applications.
Yeah, depending on how you built them in the first place, right? And especially when you're dealing with stuff from standard, from 4.8, that didn't make it across. And the big kahuna in the room is web forms, right? And we're seeing a wave towards Blazor, largely because Blazor has the same feel as web form development, right? We have component libraries, the ecosystem's gotten big around it, you recognize the programming model, it's a language you already love, like there's lots of pieces about it. And Blazor's still got its rough edges, like it's growing up a bit, and you do have to learn some new practices, but works better on mobile, like it doesn't make building a responsive web app easy automatically, but at least has more options than web forms ever did.
Yeah, and it's reusable in MAUI.
Yeah, but if I was in your shoes as a product owner, as you're going down this list of apps and saying, are we going to make the migration to core, or should we be looking at Power App? Like, should we be looking, because they're not small changes, one way or the other, but what's the deliverable on this? How many people are using it? How important is the client diversity? How important is remote access? What's our security risk as we get out of the perimeter and get into more zero trust? Like, where are those problems going to be hard? And then when you start adding that up, you're suddenly, maybe this is better served that way. I would be very tempted if I had a couple of skilled Power App folks floating around to say, every time we go at an app for a little while, I'm going to commit 2 hours to one of these folks prototyping some screens, because they can do a lot in a very little time, and say, like, how far down the path are we here, and say, should we just keep re-engineering? It's an acknowledgement that the jump from standard, from 4.8 to whatever version of core, and probably it's 6, if you don't have dependencies on those libraries that weren't migrating, the web forms and the WCFs and so forth, then it's not as hard a jump. You'd probably be a little better off, and you might find some nice things. If you're still using web forms, or you're still using WinForms, and I got nothing bad to say about GRR, because if you're the bulk of your users are living in Windows, WinForms is wildly productive, but the WinForms in Core is different, right? That SDK changed. It became good at high resolution screens, and that's awesome, but you've got to go look at every screen. You gotta. But that's less cost than rebuilding all those screens, no matter what technology you're talking about.
Yeah. So you were talking about the people who move quickly, and then the people who go a little slower after that, and then eventually people who feel like they're being left behind and they have to move.
And I was referencing a classic book called Crossing the Chasm, which was really an acknowledgement of marketplace when it comes to technology, that there's always a few folks that love being your beta testers, that sub 1%. And part of that story is like, don't get too enamored of these folks, because your next group is about a 10% of the market opportunity. And that's the forward-thinking, leading-edge personalities that are going to tolerate your rough edges. They're probably not going to be beta testers. They're still going to work on their own stuff, but they're more tolerant. And then following that is that third, the 30-something%, which are also quite progressive, but they want clear paths of migration. They want things to be more reliable.
Is that your standard early adopters?
But they're also pulling the product out of you. They want in, right? And the real chasm is after that. You've got less than half the market at that point, and what comes after that. And I brought that up mostly because cloud's at that point where we're getting to the end of that third, and we're now starting to talk about that trailing third. And you see the messaging shifting. The way we talk about cloud is different, that these are now fundamental to being productive in business. That your argument has to be, when you talk to management or talk to your CIO, it's like, are we really going to spend the capital expenditure for a new set of servers every 5 years now, when we look at the operating costs of how this app would run in the cloud? So, I spent enough time in the IT land with Run As that we're very aware of those every 5 years or every 4 years, depending on your organization, buying new hardware, renewing contracts in data centers and so forth against the cost of cloud. And each time those things are coming up, you got to have that sit down and talk through it. And you would hope that app devs are at the room, because they're also saying, well, what's the cost of moving that app? Lift and shift to VMs doesn't always go that well, and it's expensive, right? And you're really getting the worst of cloud at that point. It is the modernization that ultimately reduces the cost per app and gives you a lot of the value that wanted to do that in the first place.
Makes it run more efficiently on cloud.
Absolutely, and are tolerant of again, the pandemic brought a bunch of new things at the table. A lot of us were ignoring remote work and forcing people to be in the perimeter. You're either in the office and inside the perimeter, or you were VPNing it. That's how you did things. But you really want to work in the cloud, you're running that zero trust model where you're always authenticating. And software doesn't respond well to that if it isn't built for that.
And that opens up more people probably to work on mobile devices as well.
Yeah, if you can build the right workflows for it, right? I think that's a very broad conversation that goes back to when tablets really established themselves in the 2010s. And the best descriptions I've ever heard of that problem space is what happens when you can bring the computing device to the work rather than bring the work to the computing device. As long as it was a machine on a desk, the work had to come to you, right? It showed up in your inbox. It was paper or whatever it may be. But as soon as you talk about phones and tablets, like devices that can be brought to the work, how do we modify the workflow so that when you go to the work, you're collecting new information, right? You have a deeper understanding of the work problem there, and you can do things differently. And that's a harder problem, but hugely valuable. Like when you see the wins, when technology is used well, using those kinds of form factors, it's because they took advantage of the camera and the locality and gesture controls and all of those sorts of things to create a different experience for the work.